It was the kind of silence that only winter knows, heavy, patient, almost sacred. The Colorado forest lay under a soft quilt of snow, its trees frozen like old guardians. The only sound came from a single cabin light flickering through the mist, and from within it, the faint strum of a guitar. Margaret Hayes, 68, played softly by the window. Her fingers trembled slightly, but the melody was steady, a tune she'd written for her late husband, one she played every morning at dawn. It was her way of keeping time, of reminding herself that life still had rhythm, even when everything else had grown quiet. Then she saw it, a movement at the edge of the trees. At first, she thought it was the wind brushing against the snowdrifts, but then 2 amber eyes caught the light. A gray wolf, thin, slow, its fur matted with frost, was standing in the clearing, staring at her. Margaret froze. Wolves weren't supposed to come this close. Not here, not this near to human scent. Yet the animal didn't snarl or move. It only tilted its head, listening. She kept playing. One slow chord, another. The wolf sat down. It wasn't fear that filled her. Then it was wonder. She could see its ribs, the slight tremor in its body. This creature was old, weakened, far from its pack. But there was something else in its eyes. Not hunger, not threat. Something closer to longing. Minutes passed. The snow fell harder. The melody deepened, filling the air between them like a fragile bridge. And when the final note faded, the wolf gave a low, almost musical sound, a broken, breathy howl, and disappeared into the trees. Margaret stood by the window long after it was gone. Her heart was racing, her hands shaking, not from fear, but from a strange pull she couldn't name. That night, as the wind swept through the forest, she thought she heard it again, the faint echo of that same howl. She whispered into the dark, "Who are you, old one?" No answer came, only silence, and the snow falling endlessly beyond her window. But she would see those eyes again. And what happened next would change both of their lives forever. Long before the old wolf appeared at her window, Margaret Hayes had already learned what loneliness sounded like. It was the hush that filled her cabin after the last phone call ended, the stillness between guitar chords, the quiet that lingered after saying goodbye to someone who would never return. She had moved to the mountains of northern Colorado 15 years ago, after her husband Daniel passed away. Together, they had dreamed of retiring somewhere remote, a place where the night sky still burned with stars and the wind carried no trace of traffic. When he was gone, she came anyway. Alone. Her cabin stood on the edge of a conservation corridor, a strip of protected forest that stretched between the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forests, one of the regions chosen for Colorado's wolf reintroduction program. Each winter, she could hear the faint echoes of howls from far beyond the ridge, though she had never seen one up close. Margaret's days followed a steady rhythm. She woke with the sunrise, made tea, tended to her small greenhouse of herbs, and spent her afternoons playing the guitar that Daniel had built for her decades ago. Music was the only thing that seemed to keep the silence from swallowing her whole. She was not afraid of the forest. She knew its rules: to leave no food outside, to respect the wildlife that called it home, and to understand that sometimes the wild would come closer than expected. But the winter that brought the gray wolf to her porch was unlike any other. That year, the local paper Colorado Newsline had reported a worrying trend. Several reintroduced wolves had died near highways or been caught in conflicts with ranchers. Survival rates were dropping. Experts said older wolves often struggled the most, especially those injured or without a pack. Margaret read every article, clipping them into a scrapbook she kept by her armchair. She didn't know why, maybe because something in those stories reminded her of herself. Creatures trying to adapt to survive, even when their world had changed beyond recognition. Every afternoon at 4, Margaret sat by the window, playing the same slow melody, Daniel's song. Sometimes she played it for herself. Sometimes she imagined she was playing it for the forest, as if the mountains themselves were listening. On the day she first saw the wolf, the air had been colder than usual, so cold it hurt to breathe. She had almost skipped her routine, but something inside urged her to play anyway. And that's when she saw him, the old gray shadow that would later be called Harmony. At first she told no one. She thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps her loneliness playing games. But as days passed, the tracks in the snow appeared again, larger than a dog's, leading from the tree line to the same spot near her porch. The wolf had been coming back. Listening. Margaret began leaving her window slightly open when she played, letting the music drift into the forest. And though she couldn't explain why, she felt watched, not with fear, but with a strange mutual curiosity. That night she wrote in her journal, "There's something in those eyes. Old pain, maybe. Or wisdom. I wonder how many winters he's survived." For weeks she tried to reason with herself. Wolves are wild. You can't feed them. You can't befriend them. That was what every ranger and wildlife official said, and she agreed. But the heart doesn't always follow rules written on paper. Sometimes when she played, she could swear she heard a distant hum, a faint breathy sound rising from the trees, as if something out there was trying to join her melody. The more she listened, the less alone she felt. It wasn't until early February that the moment came, the one that would change everything. The day she stepped outside and realized the music had truly reached him. It happened on a gray morning, when the snow had hardened into thin, glittering ice. Margaret had gone outside to collect firewood, the guitar melody from the night before still lingering in her mind. That was when she noticed it, a faint trail of red on the snow just beyond her garden fence. Her heart clenched. She followed the marks carefully, her boots crunching with each step, until she saw him, the old wolf, lying beneath the birch tree near the stream. His fur was dull, tangled, his ribs pressing against skin like brittle branches. He wasn't sleeping. He was surviving. Barely. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Two aging souls, both out of place, both carrying a kind of quiet exhaustion the world rarely notices. Margaret whispered softly, "You came back." The wolf's ear twitched, his breath shallow and ragged. She took a slow step forward, her instincts torn between fear and compassion. Every part of her remembered the warnings: never approach, never feed, never interfere. But there was something about the way he looked at her, not with the wild aggression she had imagined, but with something almost human surrender. She stopped 10 feet away. The silence between them was a thin thread. Margaret slowly set down her basket and took out a small piece of venison jerky she'd been saving. She placed it gently on the snow several meters away and then stepped back. The wolf didn't move. For a while he only watched her. Then, slowly, painfully, he crawled forward, his nose twitching. When he reached the food, he didn't devour it. He sniffed, licked once, and then turned his gaze back toward her, a look that held both gratitude and shame. He could barely chew. His teeth were shattered, some missing entirely. That was when she understood. He wasn't starving because he couldn't find prey. He was starving because he could no longer eat. Margaret spent that entire day watching from her porch. The wolf lingered near the stream, drinking melted snow, his body trembling. Each time she looked up from her window, he was there, weak but alert, always facing her cabin. That night she couldn't sleep. Her mind ran through every possibility. She couldn't call animal control, they might euthanize him. She couldn't ignore him, he would die within days. There had to be another way. By morning, she had made her choice. She called the Colorado Wolf Rescue and Conservation Center, a small facility she'd once donated to. The woman on the line, Jenna, listened carefully as Margaret described the situation. "Do not approach him directly," Jenna warned. If he's injured or old, we can send a team to assess from a distance. But you must not feed him more. It could change his behavior." Margaret agreed. But after hanging up, she stood by the window for a long time, watching Harmony. Yes, that was the name she'd already begun to whisper to herself, curl beneath the tree. She couldn't let him fade away. Not yet. So that evening, she did something she knew she shouldn't. She took her guitar and stepped outside. The first note trembled in the air, fragile and uncertain. Then another deeper, fuller. The wolf's body relaxed, his ears turning toward the sound. His eyes softened, half closing, as if the music carried him somewhere beyond hunger and pain. Margaret's fingers moved with purpose, not performance, not habit, but instinct. She played like someone praying. And then something miraculous happened. The wolf tilted his head back and let out a sound, low, wavering, almost broken. A howl that wasn't about dominance or territory, but connection. A conversation between strings and breath, between woman and wild. The moment lasted less than a minute, but to Margaret, it felt eternal. When the last chord faded, Harmony lay his head on the snow, eyes blinking slowly, and drifted into sleep. Margaret whispered, "Rest now, old one. You're safe." She turned back toward her cabin, the guitar still warm in her hands. Inside, she made a promise to do whatever it took to help him legally safely, but with heart. That night, the forest echoed with distant howls from other wolves, but she knew this one was different. This was a conversation only they had shared. The days that followed became a delicate rhythm, a silent pact between woman and wolf. Every dawn, Margaret checked the clearing by the birch tree. Sometimes she found Harmony sleeping, his fur rimed with frost. Other mornings, only paw prints remained proof that he still had enough strength to roam, at least for a while. She kept her distance just as the rescue center had instructed, but she also stayed watchful. Every small movement, every breath of wind in the snow felt charged with purpose. By the end of the week, 2 specialists arrived from the Colorado Wolf Rescue and Conservation Center. Jenna, the woman Margaret had spoken to on the phone, and Dr. Lopez, a wildlife veterinarian. They set up cameras at a distance, studying Harmony's movements. The footage revealed what Margaret already knew. The old wolf's jaw was damaged, likely from an old fracture that had healed poorly. "He's not aggressive," Dr. Lopez noted, scrolling through thermal images. "He's just tired. You can see how he sits, like he's conserving energy." Jenna nodded. "We'll tranquilize him tomorrow morning and assess the teeth. If we can treat him, we'll bring him to the sanctuary for a few weeks before release." But that night, something unexpected happened. Margaret couldn't sleep, the soft hum of the rescue generator outside mixing with the distant rustle of wind. She sat by her window strumming quietly when she saw Harmony again, closer than before. The wolf was standing near her porch, head lowered as if listening. When she played, he stayed. When she stopped, he took a step forward, then another, before sitting down in the snow. Jenna whispered from behind, "He's responding to you. That's rare music, as a calming cue." Dr. Lopez smiled faintly. Maybe he recognizes the frequency. Or maybe he just recognizes kindness. At dawn, the rescue team set up a tranquilizer rifle. Margaret watched from her porch, heart pounding. She hated the idea of the dart, but knew it was necessary. A soft thwip. Harmony flinched, staggered, then sank slowly into the snow. Margaret rushed forward, but stopped at Jenna's signal. "Let us handle him." Dr. Lopez knelt beside the wolf-gloved hands, gentle. "Old male, at least 12, maybe 13, he murmured. "Malnourished. Broken canines, some infection." They loaded Harmony onto a stretcher, wrapping him in insulated blankets. Before closing the rescue van, Jenna nodded toward Margaret. "You can visit the center. You helped us find him." For a moment, Margaret reached out her fingers, brushing the fur along his neck. Coarse, but still alive. "Hang on, old one," she whispered. Days later, she visited the sanctuary, a quiet valley surrounded by pine ridges. The air smelled of medicine and pine resin. Harmony lay in a large enclosure, a heating lamp above him, his jaw carefully bandaged. The vet smiled when she arrived. "He's responding well. We're starting soft feeding ground meat mixed with broth." Margaret watched as Harmony licked the bowl slowly, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. When he lifted his head, their gazes met again. Recognition. Calm. Jenna approached with a clipboard. "Would you like to help us monitor him for a while? It might help him stay relaxed." Margaret hesitated. She wasn't trained for this. But something in her heart said yes. Weeks passed. Harmony grew stronger. Margaret learned the subtle signs, the twitch of his tail, when he was content, the way he circled before lying down, the small rumble that wasn't a growl but a sigh. Each evening before leaving, she played her guitar quietly in the observation room. And each time Harmony would lift his head, eyes closing as though the notes carried him to the forest he once knew. One night, Dr. Lopez found her there. "You know," he said softly, "wolves recognize patterns. If he connects your music with safety, it means he feels secure again." Margaret smiled faintly. Maybe music isn't just for people, but not every day was peaceful. One morning, Harmony refused to eat. His breathing grew shallow. Panic spread through the staff. An infection had returned, a small abscess in his jaw. The vet prepared antibiotics while Margaret waited outside, heart heavy. For hours she sat there, snow piling on her coat, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. Then, near dusk, Jenna opened the door and smiled. "He's stable." Stubborn old boy pulled through. Margaret laughed through tears. So did I. From that day, the bond between them deepened, not one of ownership, but of understanding. They were both old, both broken in ways the world didn't see. Yet somehow together, they had found a rhythm again. By the start of spring, Harmony's fur had regained its silver sheen. He could chew again, walk without limping. But with recovery came the next truth. Wolves do not belong in cages, no matter how kind the hands that heal them. Soon the question of his release would rise, and with it, the hardest choice of all. Spring came to the Colorado mountains like a hesitant visitor. Snowmelt ran in thin ribbons through the gullies, the pine needles glistened with dew, and the air smelled of earth again. The sanctuary buzzed with renewal birds, returning rescued coyotes, being released, and above all, Harmony standing once more on his 4 steady legs. For Margaret, each visit now carried both joy and a growing ache. She knew what was coming. Dr. Lopez had been clear. Harmony's recovery meant he could soon be released back into the monitored reintroduction zone. "His instincts are returning," he told her one afternoon as they watched from the observation platform. "He paces the fence line at night. That's a good sign he's remembering who he is." Margaret nodded, her hand resting on the railing. "And when he remembers completely," she said softly, "he'll leave." Lopez gave a gentle smile. "That's what healing is, Mrs. Hayes." In early June, wildfires began sweeping through the western ridges. It had been an unusually dry season, days of relentless sun, no rain, and winds that howled louder than the wolves themselves. Margaret could smell smoke long before the first alert reached her cabin. That evening, she turned on the radio, emergency notice for Larimer County. Wildfire, approaching containment zone. Evacuations recommended for residents within 5 miles of State Route 14. Her breath caught. The rescue center was within that zone. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat, her guitar, and keys. The forest road was already thick with haze by the time she reached the ridge. Fire crews were scattered along the roadside, orange vests glowing through the smoke. "Ma'am, you can't go any farther," a ranger shouted, blocking her path. My wolf! He's in there! Wolves can run, ma'am. You can't. But she didn't turn back. Not yet. When she finally reached the sanctuary, Jenna and Dr. Lopez were already loading animals for relocation: foxes, eagles, smaller wolves. Harmony's enclosure was empty. He's gone, Jenna said, coughing through her mask. The wind snapped the fence hours ago. He slipped into the woods. For a second, the world went silent. Gone. The words sank into her chest like a weight. Margaret staggered back, choking on smoke, until her hand brushed against something familiar, her guitar case. No, she whispered, shaking her head. He listens to me. He always has. Ignoring the shouts behind her, she climbed the ridge path, smoke swirling around like ghosts. Flames flickered through the lower trees, sparks snapping at her coat. She could barely see more than a few yards ahead, but she followed the faint rhythmic sound, a low, distant howl. There he was. Harmony standing on the ridge, the firelight painting his silver fur with streaks of red and gold. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes locked on hers. "Come on!" she cried out, her voice hoarse. "This way!" He didn't move. The fire roared closer, a living wall of sound and heat. So she did the only thing that made sense to her. She set the guitar against her knee, struck a chord, the melody she'd played every day for months. The first note cracked through the noise. The second echoed trembling but clear. And then, just like before, Harmony tilted his head, ears turning toward her. "Come on, old boy," she whispered, strumming faster. "Follow the sound." Step by step, he began to move. Through the smoke. Through the chaos. Toward her. By the time they reached the lower ridge, the rescue team had spotted them. "Over here," Jenna shouted. Two firefighters grabbed Margaret, pulling her into the truck. Harmony hesitated, the noise, the lights, the humans, all unnatural. "Leave him," one of the rescuers yelled, but Margaret turned, eyes blazing through soot. "He's coming." She played one last note, a single trembling chord. Harmony leapt from the ridge, landing beside the truck's open gate. Dr. Lopez aimed a tranquilizer dart, the only safe way to bring him in without panic. The dart struck gently, and Harmony slumped, breathing steady. Margaret reached through the bars, her soot-streaked hand brushing against his fur. "You found the music again," she whispered. "You came home." Hours later, as dawn broke through the smoke, Margaret sat outside the temporary shelter. Her face was gray with ash, her clothes torn, but her eyes shone with quiet peace. Jenna sat beside her. "You saved him, you know." Margaret shook her head. "No, he saved me first." Inside the van, Harmony slept, heartbeat slow but strong. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt that same heartbeat inside her, steady, alive, in rhythm with something bigger than herself. The forest would burn and heal. So would they. That fire would later be known as the Willow Creek Blaze, a disaster that destroyed hundreds of acres, but somehow spared the sanctuary itself. For weeks, the headlines spoke of loss. But for Margaret and Harmony, it marked something else the moment they both walked through fire and found what it meant to survive again. When the smoke finally cleared and the fires died down, Colorado's mountains wore new scars, blackened ridges, melted pine cones. Silence where songbirds used to live. But amid the ash, life persisted. Grass pushed through soot. Streams ran clearer than ever. And somewhere in the recovery zone, Harmony slept beneath soft blankets inside a reinforced medical pen. Margaret visited every week, each time greeted by the same gentle ritual. A safety gate, a clipboard, a quiet nod from the staff. Harmony would lift his head when she arrived, slower, now older, but alive. "He's healing again," Dr. Lopez said. "But this time, we can't keep him here much longer." Margaret knew what that meant. Release. freedom, and the end of something beautiful she was never supposed to have. The rescue story made its way into local headlines. Elderly woman helps save wolf during wildfire evacuation. The photo of her soot-covered face beside the sedated wolf spread quickly across social media. At first, the responses were filled with admiration, messages about bravery, kindness, and the bond between human and nature. But soon the tone changed. A rancher from the nearby valley wrote, "That same wolf could kill my cattle. Why risk human lives for a predator?" Another comment read, "Feeding wild wolves only makes them dependent. This woman should have let nature take its course." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't have to. She'd already seen what nature could do and how fragile its balance truly was. Still, the attention brought consequences. 2 weeks later, an officer from Colorado Parks and Wildlife arrived at her cabin, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Hayes," he said kindly, "we need to verify some details about your involvement. The wolf you encountered was part of a federally monitored reintroduction group. We have protocols to ensure minimal human imprinting." "I understand," she said. "I never meant to interfere. I just didn't want him to die." He sighed. "You did the right thing calling the rescue center, but these animals can't form attachments to people. It endangers them and you." Margaret nodded, though his words felt like small knives. How could she explain that it wasn't about ownership or taming? It was about recognition, two lives that had found each other at the edge of survival. Days turned into weeks, and the tension grew. A local council meeting was held to discuss the impact of reintroduced wolves after the wildfire. Margaret attended, sitting quietly in the back row. A rancher stood first. "They're multiplying faster than we can handle. Every time you save one, 3 more come down the ridge." A conservationist replied, "They're not the problem, we are. We've taken their land. The wolves are only reclaiming what was theirs." Voices rose sharp and emotional. When Margaret finally stood, the room fell silent. "I'm not here to argue about wolves," she said softly. "I just want you to know that one of them, an old one, listened to music when he was dying. He didn't attack. He didn't snarl. He listened." Her words didn't end the debate, but they softened it. For a brief moment, people stopped shouting. They just listened. After that, the rescue center called her back. "Mrs. Hayes." Jenna said over the phone, "Harmony is ready. His teeth have healed completely, and he's regained healthy weight. But before we move him to the release site, we thought you might want to see him one last time." Margaret's hand trembled around the receiver. "One last time," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. When she arrived, the staff greeted her with quiet respect. No cameras, this time. No reporters, just the steady hum of wind through the pines. Harmony stood inside the pre-release pen, the same amber eyes fixed on her. "You remember me," she said softly, resting her hand on the fence. The wolf tilted his head, that same familiar gesture that had started it all. Dr. Lopez approached. "He's ready, Margaret. The fire line's healed, and the others from his monitoring group are already back in the wild. He'll have a chance to rejoin them." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Does he have a tracking collar?" "Yes, and it'll transmit his location for the next 2 years." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll still know he's out there. That's enough." Outside the gate, Margaret paused and looked back one last time. Harmony's silhouette stood still, framed by trees. No music this time. Only wind, only memory. And yet, as she turned to leave, a low, familiar sound carried through the valley, a single rough-edged howl that faded into the distance. It wasn't goodbye, it was recognition. The morning of Harmony's release began with the kind of silence that feels sacred. No wind, no birds, just the slow, patient hum of the earth. The sanctuary gates stood open. The rescue truck parked nearby, its rear doors gleaming under a pale sunrise. Margaret stood beside Dr. Lopez and Jenna, her gloved hands resting on the guitar case she hadn't opened since the fire. They had chosen a spot deep within the protected corridor, an area where the forest had already begun to heal. The same ridge where he had first appeared months ago now glistened with new grass, the first signs of wildflowers pushing through the ash. "It's fitting," Jenna said quietly. "He returns where he began." Margaret nodded, her breath fogging in the cold air. That's the only way stories like this should end. When they opened the crate, Harmony didn't rush out. He stepped forward slowly, sniffing the air as if remembering a world he once knew. His fur shimmered silver under the morning light, the faint scars on his muzzle catching like threads of fire. Margaret knelt a few feet away, her knees pressing into damp soil. He turned toward her, no fear, no confusion, only recognition. "Go on," she whispered. "You don't need to listen to me anymore." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, the smell of every season they had shared. But Harmony stayed still, watching her. Then gently, she opened her guitar case. The strings had dulled, the wood darkened by ash. Yet when she strummed the first note, the sound rose like something remembered from a dream, fragile, pure, alive. The forest seemed to pause. Even the rescue team went silent. The melody drifted through the clearing, simple and familiar, the same tune that had once bridged the distance between them. And as it played, Harmony lifted his head and howled. It wasn't a cry of pain nor warning. It was song. When the final note faded, Harmony took a step back, then another, his gaze steady on hers. He turned toward the forest, paused once more, and gave a single low howl, softer this time, almost a whisper. Then he was gone, slipping between the pines until his gray fur disappeared into the light. Margaret stayed where she was, guitar resting against her knee. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. She wasn't crying out of loss. She was crying because something inside her had finally been returned, not to her, but to where it belonged. Jenna placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did right by him." Margaret smiled faintly. "He was never mine to keep. I just reminded him of the song." A week later, the first tracking report came through. The radio collar signal placed Harmony 30 miles north near a ridge called King Mountain Territory, once home to a small wolf pack. He was moving steadily, his path overlapping with another wolf's signal, possibly a young female. When Margaret received the news, she laughed softly to herself. "So you found someone who can keep up with your music." That night, she sat by her window, just as she had the day he first appeared. Outside, the world was quiet again. The stars hung heavy over the mountains. She reached for her guitar and played the same song, not for him this time, but for everything he represented. And somewhere far away, echoing faintly through the night air, came a distant answer, a howl rolling down from the ridges, caught by the wind, and carried toward her home. Her hands paused mid-chord. She closed her eyes and smiled. That night, the forest was alive again, not with noise, but with harmony. Not every goodbye is an ending. Sometimes it's a song that keeps playing even after the strings fall silent. Summer melted gently into autumn, and the mountains of Colorado glowed again, gold aspens, crisp air, long shadows sweeping over the ridges. The land was healing, just as those who had survived the fire were. Margaret's cabin had changed too. The porch was repaired, the greenhouse replanted. On the wall beside her window hung a single framed photograph, a still image taken from the sanctuary camera. Harmony, lying in the snow, eyes half closed, listening to her music. She didn't need anything more. Each morning, she brewed her tea, fed the blue jays that visited her railing, and checked the sanctuary newsletter on her tablet. That was how she followed Harmony's path. small red dots moving across a digital map tracing the wolf's slow journey north. King Mountain Pack sighted again, one update read. Old male with healed jaw observed hunting alongside younger pair. She smiled. "That's you, old boy," she whispered. "Still playing your song." As the months passed, visitors began writing letters to her, strangers who had seen her story in the papers. One came from a school teacher in Fort Collins. "My students watched your video with the rescue team. They asked if wolves really understand music." Another from a young ranger. "Your wolf changed how people here think. We're calling our new observation post Harmony Ridge." Margaret read each letter slowly, carefully placing them in a small box by her bedside. Not because she liked attention, but because they proved that the connection she and Harmony had shared hadn't vanished. It had multiplied. She thought often about what Dr. Lopez had said. Healing means remembering who you are. Maybe that applied to people too. One evening, as the first snow of the new winter began to fall, Margaret picked up her guitar again. Her fingers were slower now, the strings colder, but the melody still came. She played the song not as a farewell, but as a thank you. Thank you for reminding her that life still had rhythm, that even old hands could make something beautiful, that love, even for a wild creature, could outlast distance and time. As the last note faded, she stepped onto the porch. The forest stretched endlessly before her, bathed in silver moonlight. And then she heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable. A long, low howl rising from the distant ridge. Her breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. "Good night, Harmony," she whispered. Winter returned as it always does, but the silence that once filled her life was no longer empty. Now it was full of echoes of memory, of music carried by wind and snow. Sometimes when the nights grew long, she thought about how fragile the line is between the wild and the human, how easily fear builds fences, and how rarely we see what's on the other side. Harmony had taught her that those boundaries could bend, not through control, but through respect, through patience, through listening. And maybe that was the lesson the forest was always trying to teach. On her last visit to the sanctuary that year, Margaret left a note at the reception desk. It read, "For the next wolf who forgets how to be wild, play him a song. Maybe he'll remember." The staff framed it beside the entrance beneath a photo of Harmony at release. Visitors still read it before entering. Some even pause and smile, as if the air itself still hums with faint guitar strings and a wolf's answering song. Because in a way, it does. Not every story about wolves is about fear. Some are about grace, the quiet kind that arrives uninvited and changes how you see the world. Harmony was never meant to be a pet or a symbol or a miracle. He was simply himself, a creature who had lived long enough to know pain and yet still listened when the world offered him music. And maybe that's the real message hidden inside his howl, that wildness and kindness aren't opposites. They're parts of the same song played in different keys. We live in a world that moves fast, that forgets easily. But the story of one old wolf and one older woman reminds us that compassion doesn't have an expiration date, that even in the wild, empathy has a place. When we learn to see animals not as threats or trophies, but as neighbors, something shifts. Fear turns into understanding. Distance becomes connection. And what once divided us, the fence, the fear, the law, becomes a bridge of respect. The Colorado Reintroduction Program was never just about returning wolves to the land. It was about returning balance to ecosystems, to people, to memory. Because where the howl returns, the forest breathes again. Margaret Hayes never sought attention, yet her story became a quiet anthem, proof that small acts of care can echo far beyond a single life. She didn't change laws or lead campaigns. She simply listened, and in doing so, reminded everyone else to do the same. Somewhere tonight, A pack moves through the Colorado pines. Their paws press into soil once